Arc 5, Chapter 73, Theresia van Astrea. Theresia van Astrea was 12 years old when she received the divine protection of the Sword Saint. It was a sudden and unforeseen change that begat immense distress in her life. In the midst of her ordinary, everyday life, it abruptly swooped down upon her.
Could it be that I got chosen?
This was an honest emotion, the emotion she greeted the divine protection with. And Theresia continued to keep this truth a secret for some time. The renowned Astrea family's forte was the sword, and had given rise to sword saints for generations continuously. Thanks to the achievements accomplished hundreds of years ago by the first-generation sword saint Reinhard Astrea, the Dragon Kingdom of Lugunica recognized the sword of the Astrea family as an indispensable existence and asset. This tradition had been passed down for centuries, including in Theresia's times. Henceforth, it was halfway cemented that all those born into the Astrea family, regardless of possessing the divine protection of the sword saint or not, were to live a life of commitment toward the sword. This, of course, appertained to her father, her two elder brothers, and her lone younger brother, the youngest sibling as well. Regardless of becoming a swordsman or attaining the divine protection or not, they were supposed to acquaint themselves with the sword the moment they achieved awareness of mind per convention. When it came to how Theresia, who was born into the Astrea family where this route of upbringing was natural, was maturing, she was spending her days utterly divorced from the sword. Of course, those born into the Astrea family, regardless of gender, were supposed to take the sword in their hands. There were days when Theresia and her brothers were all made to swing the sword under strict tutelage. There were such days indeed, but Theresia had absolutely no notable aptitude for the sword. Rather, it would be more so precise to say she had not even the slightest orientation for facing the sword. Like many girls, Theresia held no interest in the sword. It was not a matter of competency. Unmotivated swordsmanship, shiftless training accompanied with a defiant attitude. It was unsurprising that her parents would eventually come to notice it was futile to make her keep swinging the sword if she continued to act like this. The divine protection of the sword saint was bestowed only upon those who had proven themselves worthy of receiving the love of the sword god. Generations were witness. Only the members of the Astrea family were capable of inheriting the divine protection of the sword saint. At the very least, that was the common belief, since no actual details regarding the inheritance of the divine protection were known. It was only when the swordsman faced the sword with absolute earnestness that the divine protection recognized them and bestowed itself upon them. A girl child, possessing no interest in the sword, the firstborn daughter who continued to avert her eyes away. It was all an inevitable course of events that, as the possibility of Theresia being the sword saint quickly diminished to abandonment, her greed of freedom was permitted. Theresia forcibly snatched her freedom from the sword training, but she, too, had her own respective say with regards to it. Of course, both her absolute disinterest in the sword saint and failure to devote herself to the sword were causes for the shiftlessness of her training, but her greatest cause was unrelated to these. Theresia was aware that she had been born with the divine protection of the death god. The wounds she would inflict onto others would ceaselessly bleed, incapable of healing. Upon realizing her forte lay in taking the lives of others, what took birth within a young Theresia was the dread of what could result from her very palms. Something like sword training was perfect for augmenting her horror. Be it simply practice or training, Theresia's divine protection, over which she had no control, would pay no regard to the situation, Even if the wound she may inflict were to be as meager as a scratch, the fact that it would not heal made it no trivial affair. Especially considering that a wound which may accidentally get inflicted during sword practice could prove to be deadly. Henceforth, liberated from the sword training, the secretive Theresia felt alleviated. To live without hurting others was something astoundingly difficult should one remain conscious of it. Even if one were to intentionally, actively seek to not hurt others, accidental mishaps or unwitting deeds could be committed by anyone. How could she ever determine whether the divine protection would activate or not, in case of getting a cut on the finger due to a piece of shattered dish? The young girl named Theresia inadvertently avoided having relationships with people. If she never made contact, if she never came close, she would not have to worry about hurting people. She naturally evaded gazes. She started spending more and more time with flowers. Having attained the freedom to discard the sword, she made a flower bed in the garden of her mansion for herself only. Growing seasonal blossoms there, she became a girl who loved admiring them. Her brothers, who used to swing the sword in utter distress, were repeatedly subject to strenuous and agonizing training. It was not as if she did not feel left out or sorry for them, seeing their figures, merely unable to communicate about her divine protection. The only ones she could confide in were solely the flowers her own self had nurtured.
I wonder if someday even I would be able to live by someone's side.
Her distress, her doubts, the only ones she could confide such feelings of hers in were solely the flowers as well, as their petals danced to the rhythm of the gentle breeze. Like many people, Theresia too was an ordinary young girl who desired to love and to be loved. However, days of soliloquy as she questioned whether her own self, who had flouted the intents of her brothers or her parents, and had the awareness of divine protection that may hurt and rob someone, had the right to stand by someone's side, meant no end. In the midst of such days, the love of the sword god was showered upon Theresia.
Could it be that I got chosen?
Without warning, that cognizance dawned upon Theresia. It enshrouded her far more akin to a sense of incongruity, rather than consciousness like that of her divine protection of the death god. It was natural. To her, awareness of the divine protection she had been born with was a matter of course, like eyes providing vision and ears providing hearing. Something like suddenly gaining a new divine protection would feel something like the emergence of wings on her back. What could she possibly greet novel faculties that originally did not exist with, except for incongruity?
I must not take the sword in my hands!
So thought Theresia, harboring abhorrence and nausea towards her new divine protection. She thought back to the times when she had been coerced to swing the sword. She realized how pointless, meaningless, senseless, and aimless her actions had been back then. She was now instinctively able to apprehend how to swing the sword the best, the optimum, the ideal, the finest way. Herself, whose forte lay very much in killing people, now gained full proficiency in killing people. This was terror. This was despair. This was the day the world ended. Kneeling down, she came to realize that she was a death god who had taken the form of a girl, and that her days of impersonating a young girl had come to an end. Theresia did not tell anyone about the divine protection she had obtained. She intended to conceal her possession of the divine protection of the death god and the divine protection of the sword saint for all eternity, and hide it within her heart that she was a monster whose only purpose was to kill others. Imploring that she was unwell, she shut herself in her room in the mansion. Forgetting to look after even her flower bed, Theresia hid within her shell, doing naught but sleeping, painting a childish reverie that, if only one day upon awakening out of breathlessness, that it would all turn out as a dream. She continued to enclose herself in her shell. But that was ultimately just the immaturity of a child, refusing to face what she did not wish to face. It immediately became clear that Theresia had inherited the divine protection of the Sword Saint.
Nisan, the next Sword Saint is your daughter, this child.
The head house of the Astrea family, Theresia's birthplace, and the base of the family line of Sword Saints, revealing that Theresia, curled up in her bed, would be the next Sword Saint. Her uncle, the preceding Sword Saint, stepped foot into the mansion. The divine protection of the Sword Saint was an exceptional divine protection, capable of only being inherited by members of the Astrea family, with this trend continuing for generations. That divine protection would be inherited by the next Sword Saint from the preceding Sword Saint on a certain day without any prior notice. And once the inheritance was complete, the previous Sword Saint was freed from his responsibility and lost the divine protection. Once the current Sword Saint lost the divine protection, it was natural that the identity of the next Sword Saint would be searched for thoroughly by the kingdom. And the previous Sword Saint could identify who the next Sword Saint was at a single glance. Theresia's days of enclosure met their end.
Take the sword in your hands, Theresia.
Having become dreadfully skinny, her hair in shambles, Theresia was dragged out into the garden. Barefooted, in sleepwear, with her consciousness drifting between dreams and reality, yet there she was, dragged outside by force and coerced into holding the wooden sword by her uncle. With her now skinny fingers, Theresia gestured her resistance along with shaking her head several times. However, the protests of her opposed self went unheard. Her uncle made her re-grip the wooden sword again and again, pushing Theresia's back once she clutched the handle in surrender. Before Theresia stood the eldest brother of the 4 siblings. Her eldest brother, his features tender and amiable, stood there with an addled expression. His puzzlement could be understood at a glance, unable to accept the events transpiring before his eyes. Far too many unknowns. Pondering so, Theresia was startled by her own self-ruminating so. That confoundment directly smiting her heart, Theresia simply kept her eyes open, speechless. Ignoring Theresia and her condition, her uncle called to her eldest brother in a deep voice. To hold the wooden sword and clash with Theresia head-on, he ordered. To prove his abilities of swordsmanship by striking down and defeating his younger sister, he ordered. There was no way he could do that, her eldest brother clamored. Her brother was very kind. He had trained strenuously with the sword, and held no uncertainty in the way of the Astrea family. But her brother could be nothing but kind towards his younger sister, Theresia. She was afraid of hurting him, so she was never the one to initiate physical contact. But she loved being hugged and held up in her brother's arms and that large body of his. He was a kind brother. Then echoed the damning voice of her uncle, calling her brother a coward. Upon the derision of the preceding Sword Saint, her brother made an expression terribly hurt by his words, who admired his form. Theresia knew who it was that her eldest brother, her elder brother, and her younger brother admired and had thus continued to swing the sword. reviled by that person. Her eldest brother was immensely wounded. Her 2 other brothers, standing at the edge of the garden, having also come outside by hearing all the commotion, also made similarly hurt faces. Ultimately, her eldest brother, preserving a wounded visage, wielded dreadful readiness in his eyes. Straightening the wooden sword he held in his hands, seeding all his energy into it, he set his eyes upon his target. Through the shivers in the tip of his sword, and a certain sharpness in her elder brother's eyes, Theresia discerned. Her brother sought to knock down Theresia's sword using the wooden sword clutched in his own hands, such that she would remain unscathed. His stance, his line of sight, and the essence of swordsmanship enveloping his body all conveyed this. At her brother's level of skill, it would certainly not be a difficult task against an inferior opponent. It was ample enough to prove his ability as a swordsman and taking the sword away from Theresia. Her uncle vociferated, marking the beginning of a spar neither side wished to partake in. Her eldest brother bellowed vigorously as the honed essence of swordsmanship slashed into Theresia. Swordsmanship was solely the strength to dwindle the opponent and controlling their movements. If she were not to even upraise her sword, it would be a facile affair to knock the wooden sword down. From the onset, the very foundation of this fight was erroneous. Neither did Theresia possess any reason to fight, nor did her brother possess any reason to hurt Theresia. With the interests of both the sides aligned, there should not be any discord. There should not be, and yet...
That's it.
A wooden sword that had been sent flying landed on the garden some distance away, echoing a report. Upon returning to the awestruck voice of her uncle, and what was visible was the figure of Theresia, the wooden sword in her hand lunged forward, and its edge touching the throat of her staggered brother, who let out a hoarse exhale. She recalled intercepting her brother's sword strike descending upon her, and taking his wooden sword away. She then appended the edge of her sword to his neck, conveying she could kill him at any instant, proving the disparity between their proficiency. Her eldest brother, overwhelmed by what had come to pass, fell to his knees on the spot. Theresia's lips quivered while she turned around as to assure herself of this, and laid eyes upon her parents, and her second eldest and her younger brothers observing the duel. Expressions stunned. Everyone was watching over the results in disbelief.
The next sword saint is Theresia, indeed, unquestionably.
An aver, only the solitary voice of her uncle echoed, exceedingly unavailingly so. Theresia dropped the wooden sword she held, glanced at her hand, and then proceeded to pull her red hair with the same, pulling them off so violently that she would bleed, giving rise to a wail akin to that of a beast. She screamed. Screaming, losing sanity, despairing to the extent of vomiting blood, regretting. Theresia became the sword saint. The time her brothers had devoted to the sword, Theresia's virtuosity with the sword had callously trampled upon all of it. Things like time and effort dedicated held no purport whatsoever in face of overwhelming sword prowess. In Theresia's eyes, having become the sword saint, the flaws in her brother's swords were clear. She was now rather surprised for failing to notice these flaws at an earlier note, despite spending so much time with them. Nonetheless, in spite of the manifest disparity between their strength and Theresia's, her brothers continued to pitiably train with the sword. Neither her eldest brother, nor her second eldest brother, nor her younger brother possessed passion for anything other than the sword. Because of having been born into the Astrea family, having grown up in a distinguished household esteemed for the sword, and having dedicated much of their life to the sword, thus even if their younger sister, their elder sister, robbed them of the zenith, they had no choice but to continue resuming forth. Despite knowing that they could never possibly reach that territory.
How truly stupid.
She could not help but conceive that thought. They could just do what they loved, and yet, even though the sword did not even matter anymore, and yet, since they could no longer forgive Theresia, they could just live in worlds of their own liking, and yet...
Theresia-sama, preparations for leaving are complete. It is about time. We ought to head out now.
As Theresia gazed out the window, observing her brothers swinging their swords in the garden below, a voice called to her. Turning around, ahead of her stood a young girl of identical age, the latter's beautiful blonde hair cut short. She was Carol Remendis, a member of the Remendis family, acclaimed for its superlative knights and acknowledged for her exceptional swordsmanship, who had been appointed as Theresia's attendant as one of close age. Verily, her abilities as a swordsman were indeed exceptional, though a comparison she would rather not voice out loud. Her swordsmanship could rival that of her elder brothers. A solemn personality and a devout of swordsmanship, she could not help but feel uneasy as a fellow woman.
Yes, let's go. For today we have the tutoring of the people of the castle, isn't it?
Yes. Everyone in the castle also has their hopes up for being educated by Theresia-sama. Though, of course, I also hold the same sentiment.
I think you are sufficiently strong, Carol.
Not at all. Someone as myself is incapable of even reaching the feet of Theresia-sama.
So elucidated Carol her own ability, as though denigrating herself. An exceedingly idiosyncratic appraisal by Theresia's perspective. After all, Theresia had never even once upheld the sword before Carol until now. No, that was far from everything. Theresia's hands had last held a sword on the day she sparred with her eldest brother using wooden swords. For more than 2 years since, Theresia lay not even a finger upon the sword. Nonetheless, the responsibilities as the sword saint came to pass. Her own self being the sword saint alone was a truth beyond veil. She could not go as far as to inconvenience the entirety of the Astrea family, so she was willing to perform solely her duties diligently.
It shall be understood upon seeing what ought to be seen. Even if I have not gotten the opportunity to seeing that form, should Theresia-sama take the sword in her hands, she shall surely haul out the strength unrivaled by anyone.
She gave a wry smile in response to Carol's conviction. In her company, Theresia went to tutor on-duty soldiers. Even in the name of tutoring, she had not achieved anything remarkable. She would simply go around and have them wield their weapons and train, and point out flaws in their battling as always. Nothing unusual. A fearsome aspect of the divine protection of the Sword Saint was perhaps how it honed all instincts in battle. This did not pertain solely to swords. Let it be spears or axes, were they connected to battle techniques and maneuvers, Theresia was aware of the entirety of their strengths and weaknesses alike. If the soldiers' mistakes were pointed out to them one by one, their movements would alter to an indiscernible degree. However, from Theresia's perspective, though unmistakably their conduct was abound in defects, even that smidgen of an alteration marked an immense difference for those untalented. Theresia bore guilt when she was thanked, respected, esteemed.
I want to run away right this instant. I want to go away from this place. A place where this power and wish for is requisite.
Just as when she had undertaken the divine protection of the Sword Saint, Theresia despaired for the present. She lapsed into shutting herself in her room, enclosing herself in her shell, seeking to hope for the tides of fate to change direction. It may have been punishment cast upon her, for weighing her own desires onto others, for escaping her liabilities. In the dragon kingdom of Lagunica, a clash occurred with the great demi-human alliance. Deeply tied to the custom of discrimination against demi-humans that remained pronounced within the kingdom, in but a heartbeat, it intertwined with multitudinous years' worth of discontentment of the demi-humans in the kingdom, and flared up. The greatest and worst civil war in the history of the kingdom, the Demi-Human War, broke out. Originating from the east of the kingdom, this civil war worsened by the passing day. A small force of demi-humans at first, one which seemed easily suppressible, but the kingdom made light of the depth of relationships between demi-humans behind closed doors. Furthermore, there seemed to exist those acting as intermediaries between respective races lacking relations, and the blaze of the civil war distended its radius in an instant. The flaring vortex of warfare ceaselessly permeated the kingdom, and after an entire year of fruitless attempts of extinguishing these flames, at last the kingdom acknowledged this was a situation unprecedented.
Inform Theresia van Astrea, the current Sword Saint, along with the knights and soldiers currently scuffling to subdue the civil war. Great feats are expected by the nobility as well.
The higher aristocrats, who put together a force unlike anything before, having accepted it as a predicament of the entire kingdom, could not possibly save the strongest being, known as the Sword Saint, for last. As a matter of course, Theresia was also informed of the orders for partaking in the civil war. Theresia attained unprecedented despair at the arrival of the conforming inevitable. This was unlike her days of selfishly refusing to take the sword. What was expected of her now was not to wield the knowledge as the Sword Saint, but to wield true swordsmanship and might as the Sword Saint. She had no choice but to grasp the sword. This was also the first time she had been accorded the dragon sword reed, which solely the Sword Saint was allowed to wield across generations.
However, that sword can only be drawn when it is fit to be drawn. I believe you will have to carry another sword from that one too. You can choose one as per your suitability.
Her uncle, the former Sword Saint, gave her advice from seeming experience. Her uncle, whose waist was once saddled with the dragon sword, was acquainted with the whimsical nature of the sword. Abiding by her uncle's advice, Theresia chose a single-swing longsword, one also favored and of habitual use by Carol, her attendant, after seeing through it once as having good compatibility with herself. In her first battle, Theresia's first unit consisted of Carol, along with her brothers and her uncle as well. Theresia's first battle from her perspective, though she would not go as far as to call it an opportunity for honor and altruism. Even so, it was indisputably an event she must not avert her eyes from, an ideal opportunity to make the sword of the current generation Astrea family known across the kingdom. No matter Theresia's state of mind and heart, her surroundings progressed capriciously. Anyone and everyone nursed an arbitrary expectation that defeat was impossible should the Sword Saint be there. The unrestrained, insensitive faith by those surrounding her which falsified upon her terrorized Theresia. As always, divulging it to no one, repressing it within her heart, Theresia simply, earnestly trembled prior to her first battle. And in the middle of her plight.
Are you scared, Theresia?
Yes. The one to reach out to her with this benign voice was nobody else but her eldest brother. As she awaited her first unit and battle in a tent, her tender brother's words rendered Theresia astounded. Theresia had purposefully been avoiding contact with her eldest brother. No, her eldest brother had not been the only one she had been avoiding. Her second elder brother, her younger brother, as well as her parents and her uncle. She had desisted from coming into contact with all of them. After a span of nigh 2 years, she exchanged words with her kind, truly beloved brother. Lost for words, Theresia could do naught but resume looking downwards. However, her brother sat down next to Theresia, a forlorn expression adorning her face, proceeding to hug her and gently caress her head. Her brother's palm, yet the same as before, confounded Theresia.
I'm well aware that you harbor a feeling of indebtedness towards me and the rest of our brothers. It's not like I didn't think anything after losing to you that way either, but...
Severing his words, her brother showed her a faint smile. This was her brother's very smile, one which Theresia had continually looked up to, time and again.
You're my precious little sister, so if you think you don't want to, if you're scared, then I must protect you. Because I'm your big brother.
Nisan.
Tears overflowed. She mustn't leak any cavils. More than anyone else, nobody else but him, solely the brother whom she had defeated with her own hands, mustn't hear it. So she believed, yet she made that brother repudiate it.
After losing to you, it was vexing. There were times I even considered quitting. But even still, I loved the sword above all. I'm grateful that I was born into this family, to have our little brothers and to have you, my little sister. I'm grateful to the sword. That's why I'm glad I swung the sword.
How truly foolish her thoughts had been. Theresia was enlightened to her own idiocy. Watching her brothers pursue training with the sword even after their defeat against her, she thought that they had no alternative path, because they were ignorant regarding all else. They were swinging the sword and continued to cling to the sword since they had no choice. Surmising so, she had looked down upon them. That he should just do whatever he loved. Theresia had arbitrarily put her brother on her own scale and conjectured about him. The brother she ought to have looked up to, ought to have esteemed and respected, whom she dearly loved. She had mocked him on sole terms of swordsmanship. Who was stupid here? She was far more stupid here. And the sword god himself was utmost stupid here. Why did he not shower his love upon the human who loved him this much? Why did he bless a human like herself who continued to avert from the sword? Her brother, or other people like her brother, were the ones upon whom that blessing rightfully should have hailed upon. Yet...
There's no need for you to fight. After all, you're a kind girl who wouldn't dare kill even an insect.
Dreading the might of the divine protection of the death god, she had lived her life making certain she hurt no one or no thing. Her brother's understanding was slightly unalike, but her brother had been kind enough to understand the state and way of his little sister. This granted her such joyfulness, for her heart trembled the most in these past many years. In the end, she had presumed upon him. She cried to him, clung to him. In the end, she entrusted all up to her brother. In this first battle of Theresia's, her brother perished protecting their troop headquarters. Not even once did Theresia swing the sword. She could not. And once again, for years to come, never did Theresia ever even so slightly touch the sword. It had been 5 years since the Demi-Human War started, and Theresia had turned 19. The divine protection of the Sword Saint remained unvarying, resuming to silently breathe within her. Yet the pivotal Theresia drifted away from opportunities of brandishing that force, abstaining from involvement with the ever-deteriorating civil war, spending her days sedate and lackadaisical. Theresia's first battle, in which she had been unable to battle. The war front anticipating the Sword Saint's strenuous efforts utterly crumbled, and amidst martyred her eldest brother. Disconcerted by the impact of her brother's death, Theresia was thereon rendered incapable of touching the sword. The actuality of the current generation's Sword Saint having such a dishonorable first battle was entirely concealed from the public. The existence of the Sword Saint also stood as a spiritual pillar for the kingdom. They could not possibly reveal she had wept and cried on her first battle, and had enclosed herself away upon letting her brother die. Henceforth, without letting the public be aware of it, Theresia's dishonor was erased from all records. Furthermore, as Theresia enclosed herself without fulfilling her duties as the Sword Saint, her second elder brother and younger brother hurled themselves into the battlefield, seeking to battle in a way that shan't dishonor the name of the Astrea family, and perished. Her eldest brother, kind to a fault, who would listen to any wish of hers with a troubled expression, as well. Her second elder brother, who was slightly mean, but was always the first one to apologize when they made up, as well. Her younger brother, adorable and endearing, a scaredy cat and a crybaby who would always walk behind her, following her path, as well. All of them lost their lives, fighting in Theresia's stead, who failed to do so.
I made you go through a lot of things you did not want to, didn't I? Sorry, Theresia.
Her uncle, the former Sword Saint, the source of motivation for their troops, also martyred. Fighting battles after battles, pushing through his injuries, and finally acting as the rear unit guard of retreating friendly troops, he sacrificed himself heroically. It was not as though she did not hold anything against her uncle. Had it not been for her uncle's revelation, perhaps nobody could have ever realized that Theresia had inherited the divine protection of the Sword Saint. Had that never been brought to light, her brothers may not have had to resolve themselves for their own deaths in this civil war, and may not have died. In that course of thought, she surely did harbor a grudge against him. She did, but she also felt like she did not. Her uncle must have himself known better than anyone else the weight of the title of Sword Saint. Since he had been the previous Sword Saint, naturally, the same things must have been sought from her uncle as they were from Theresia. In his personal way, he must have acted for the optimum operation of the name of the Sword Saint for both the kingdom, as well as Theresia. Should that not work, then there were the words he said whilst parting ways when she met him for the final time. Hearing those words, Theresia was no longer able to resent her uncle. Thus, if she were to look for someone to resent, the only option left was solely herself. Her weak self, who did not but weep and cry, despite inheriting the title of something like the Sword Saint.
Theresia-sama is someone who will surely stand one day. That time has simply not arrived yet.
Carol, her attendant, never did once try to abandon Theresia, who was engulfed by the repeated deaths of her loved ones, of her brothers and her uncle. Bearing her first unit in battle to unsightly defeat, proceeding to drift away from following opportunities due to childish selfishness, the now solitarily enclosed Theresia, within her shell, was someone Carol yet strived to have faith in. Nowadays, there were even such instances that she undertook even the orders given to Theresia from the royal castle in her stead, exposing her own self to hazard. Yet, despite knowing how perilous a bridge Carol was treading, Theresia failed to respond to her feelings. Yet was herself blessed with the talent of killing people. Herself had never, ever even envisioned there shall come a day wherein she shall agonize over her inability to kill people. Nowhere could she find a reason to fight. She could not possibly fight. Once away from Carol's monitoring, Theresia aimlessly left the mansion and started walking in the royal capital. It had been 5 years, and the Civil War yet resumed without cease, and the capital's vibrancy too had been desaturated, as a somewhat dreary atmosphere proliferated across. With no bright topics about, neither would any gleam glisten the expression of people. Naturally, avoiding crowded locations, Theresia sought solitude. The place which Theresia had recently taken a liking for and frequented her trips to was an unfinished block of land at the edge of the royal capital. A block of land whose construction had been thrown aside midway through the process with the onset of the Civil War. Through aisles and paths befitting of the descriptor narrow, and through gaps of buildings suitable for being labeled ruins, she headed towards the area deep behind. Faintly opening up, the space unworthy of even being categorized as an open plaza, was Theresia's favorite. Her heart would not become particularly ebullient. However, this bare space idly existing amidst all this desolation felt alike and conforming with the state of her own heart, and simply calmed her. In the morning breeze, cool and fresh to an ironic extent, Theresia headed for the back of the area. Sitting on a flight of stone steps connecting to no place, what could be seen on the other side was a spanning flower garden with abounding yellow blooms. The rays of the sun shining in, and soil unnecessarily adequate for the growth of flowers. In this clandestine setting beyond the calls of anyone, Theresia had deftly sown the seeds of these flowers. She was scarce of willpower to tend to the flower beds back in the mansion which had entirely withered. But she did solely bear at least the sentiment of watching over the results of the flower seeds she had whimsically sown.
I haven't even watered you, yet you have grown this much. Flowers are strong.
Whilst Theresia reflected on her own weakness, the flowers, gazing only towards the sky, their petals unfurled, bloomed in errant magnificence. She formerly admired their splendor, but now harbored longing for their strength. There were things in her heart that welled up, and she verged onto crying. Her hand on the kanthe of her eyes unwittingly warming, she frantically suppressed her tears. Such was the moment when a honed presence drew near.
I'm sorry.
A swordsman had barged into Theresia's morning sanctuary. Verging on showing her tears, Theresia articulated so, deliberately in an attempt to act strong, and then she glanced at the one standing in the plaza. She saw and was completely wonderstruck. Trimmed brown hair, elegant yet fierce eyes, a flexible, slim, and fit body, and his brimming clear skin dazzling so bright to a frightening extent. It was a fact that his attitude, affable by no means, possessed astonishing traits. However, what had astonished Theresia at that moment was not anything so trifling. To Theresia, the youth was visible as though he was a single unsheathed sword. She felt as if firm, sharp steel molded with heat itself had laid eyes upon her. In the face of that phantasm, Theresia's heartbeats faintly tangled. Placing a hand on her chest, Theresia contemplated what had happened to her. However, she simply thought she did not wish for the youth to discern this entanglement of her heartbeats. Henceforth, in order to veil that, Theresia weaved words.
So there are people who would come here so early in the morning, all the way here.
Huh?
Quite the greeting that had been. Theresia spoke to him sociably, but the youth narrowed his eyes, as though sharp, honed essence of swordsmanship piercing her. An essence of swordsmanship so stable and prime that it did not seem like a threat. Perhaps he perceived Theresia as unpleasant, an indication of his desire to repel her. Abruptly, it became unentertaining. If that was the card he was going to play, then neither would Theresia hold anything back. She would forge it into him that the essence of swordsmanship he was so proud of was kaput.
Did something happen? You're making such a scary face.
At Theresia's words, the youth made an expression as if he had tasted an undershoulder swing down. He seemed to have judged Theresia as a laywoman at swordsmanship, and not just that, at fighting entirely and nothing more. The truth was, he was not wrong. Theresia lacked any experience of actual fighting, nor did she possess any records of swinging the sword. For she was a young girl, inevitably a laywoman, supposed to be stronger than anyone else she shall fight.
What's a woman doing here so early in the morning?
The youth responded, his words crass and insolent. The voice of the youth, having heard it for the first time, was sullen yet simple and easy to listen to. And once again, she felt the rhythm of her heartbeats go a shade off note. Ever since, Theresia and the youth started seeing each other often. It seemed that the youth, apparently, used to come to the plaza on fixed holidays. It did seem like he was bothered by Theresia's presence, but never forced her to vacate nonetheless. Perhaps he regarded approaching her as being a greater bother. Theresia used to walk up to the plaza in order to view that yellow flower garden. There were times the youth was the first one to arrive, whereas on other instances, Theresia came first. Whilst Theresia seated herself on the stone steps and beheld the flower garden, the youth devoted himself to training with the sword, his sword of prime quality, and these activities became the promise between the two, who used to spend time in that location. A secretive glimpse at the swords dance of the youth. Inadvertently, she verged on leaking a sigh. For Theresia to observe the swordsmanship of others and feel this way was something exceptionally rare. No, this may have been the first time. She had initially bore revulsion toward the form of the youth gripping the sword. Rather than the youth being at fault, it was an issue of Theresia's own disposition of heart. Having fled from the role of sword saint, even at the place she had escaped to, she came face to face with someone clasping a sword. She would get chased away even from the refuge of comfort she had finally gained. Such pathetic anxieties were overwritten the day she first witnessed the sword's dance of the youth. The sword which the youth swung could not be appraised as refined, even for the sake of flattery. In the eyes of Theresia, who possessed the divine protection of the sword saint, there present were easily discernible imperfections in it as well. Being revolted by the far too many a blemish in the swords of others was also a bad habit of Theresia's. But in the youth's case, despite the presence of said flaws, his passion alone more than amply made up for them. Theresia's brothers, too, must have devoted their entirety to the sword as well. Even when it pertained to the swords of her brothers, elder or younger, Theresia failed to remain without revulsion. Yet, why did she not feel simply the same in the youth's swords? The answer to that was simple to a staggering extent.
How stupid.
There were absolutely no impurities in the sword of the youth. Dedicating, devoting everything to the sword. Easily put and expressed in words, and until now Theresia believed her brothers had done the same. But it was truly outrageous. Right here existed the fervor of the youth who, truly, possessed nothing but the sword. He had naught but the sword. He loved naught but the sword. He would love naught but the sword, a single swing of steel.
How stupid.
Observing the youth's swordsmanship beside, Theresia felt warmth enter her cheeks. Theresia was the sword saint, immersed in the love of the sword god, a being made to stand atop the pinnacle of the sword. Ahead of his unrelenting goal stood her. Although it was unquestionably her own delusion, she felt as though he sought for her. The sword saint Theresia could comprehend everything about the sword with but a glance. She could perceive its essence and quintessence, no matter what kind of treasured sword, enchanted sword, dulled sword it was, or even if it was the dragon sword. She could freely maneuver them all. There existed no steel unbared within Theresia's hands. He was the only one. He was the only steel who would not bend per Theresia's free will. He was a sword, yet his limits could not be determined by herself, who was the sword saint. That was indubitably why herself had grown to care so much about him. Months after meeting him, she had exchanged names with the youth. Wilhelm. Even though they had happened upon each other on a multitude of occasions, never did they once inquire about each other's names. The truth was, Theresia had awaited the opportunity several times, but Wilhelm wholly failed to notice that wish. They had finally managed to exchange names solely because Theresia got impatient and initiated it, and Wilhelm merely gave the appropriate response.
I'd called you the flower woman in my mind until now.
Just how impolite can he be, this man?
His words had not a fragment of solicitude, nor was his mind preoccupied with his own self, possessing no regard for her. He would converse for a bit and, upon being arbitrarily satisfied, he would then return home, so Theresia's heart was nothing but toyed around with.
Do you like flowers?
No, I hate them.
This was his reply, despite seeing the magnificence of Theresia's special flower garden so many times. Undoubtedly, he was incapable of merely playing along with the other party or uplifting their spirits. Despite feeling angst toward that, she could not help but ponder.
This is precisely what makes him such a sword-esque person, too.
During these times, the realization of the existence of herself who was saved by the presence of a sword that would not alter the way she wished it to, something not of any note to the sword saint, eluded Theresia.
Why do you swing the sword?
Ever since they had exchanged names, the words they exchanged commenced varying as well. They used to talk about flowers, followed by other miscellaneous topics, then parted ways. What conceived malaise in their usual exchanges was surely due to the dolefulness on that day. The attempts to subdue the demi-human war had failed, and Theresia had heard about the skirmishes on the battlefield. Scattered across the kingdom, the demi-humans who were at the core of all the destruction advancing were outstandingly strong, and among them was a witch commanding immense supernatural strength, whose existence had also been confirmed, was what she had heard. She abruptly became uneasy. Long before, she had heard from Wilhelm that he was a soldier for the kingdom. He was, regardless, an extraordinary swordsman. In addition, his eyes seemed terribly starved for blood. A kingdom jostled by civil war, he was truly suitable to be its soldier. Regardless, he was not undefeatable whatsoever. He may cease coming to this morning plaza someday. This disquietude made Theresia inquire. Putting a finish to his swords dance, the sweaty Wilhelm straightforwardly focused into Theresia's eyes. He then paused and contemplated for a brief moment, and shrugged his shoulders, gesturing how foolish he deemed her enquiry as.
Because this is all I have.
So he responded, befitting of a single swing of steel. That was truly the answer Theresia had precisely hoped for. And yet, Theresia became cognizant of the sensation of her chest being whittled by trepidation and isolation.
Have you come to like flowers?
No, I hate them.
Why do you swing the sword?
Because this is all I have.
As time went by, it had become a solemn promise between the two to assuredly reiterate this exchange alone. Theresia herself did not know what answer she sought to the unremitting, recurrent questions. She was unaware whether it was fine to be soothed by the answers remaining unchanged, or whether she ought to anticipate alteration in his self who resumed being like unvarying steel. Imprudently leaving things she did not know the way they were was the very essence of Theresia. Just as how she, whilst entrusted with the title of the Sword Saint, had sent her brothers to their deaths, had saddled Carol with responsibilities, and now continued to live a time of indolence. That was why change always paid a call, all whilst ostracizing Theresia from itself. The one to arrive at the plaza first, primarily, used to be Theresia. She now had a grasp on Wilhelm's visits, which had been irregular previously, and was fully equipped with what greetings and conversations to exchange when she met him in addition. Theresia had also come about to realize she had been indulging in his being. By exchanging words with Wilhelm, by having her eyes upon he who had dedicated his everything to the sword, Theresia was briefly able to forget the burden of the Sword Saint placed upon her. Because she was the Sword Saint, she had been beguiled by him, and as he seemingly told her that being the Sword Saint was all guff, she was being saved by him. Whether she wished to remain being the Sword Saint, or whether she did not wish to, that alone was mendacious. Within the lukewarm water devoid of an answer, unabating, illimitable guilt submerged her. His presence made her forget even that.
Wilhelm!
As usual, sensing the presence almost easy to discern, Theresia turned to her back. Standing on the entrance of the plaza was a youth of the sword. Her lips unwittingly moved, manifesting a smile which Theresia cast toward him.
Huh?
The moment of an unforeseen collapse of emotions was then. Eyes distended, lips quivering, Wilhelm concealed his face with a trembling palm. Theresia too was astonished by his dramatic response, undergoing shock. Questioning where she had erred, Theresia rushed over to him as he covered his face. However, she was ignorant of what to say. To this day, Theresia did her utmost to decline connection in order to not hurt others. Thus, even when she hurt someone's heart, she knew no way of handling it. She despaired toward her own self, who knew not, and never endeavored to know. Toward her own self, who failed to pronounce a word before the distressed Wilhelm.
Wilhelm.
Unknowing of what to say, Theresia's fingers reached for Wilhelm. Just how long had it been since she had initiated physical contact with anyone? Petrified of wounding others, she became incapable of touching anyone. Yet in these moments, to walk away from him without touching him was far more petrifying. Theresia touched Wilhelm's hand, which was covering his face via her fingers. As he trembled terribly, dishearteningly, tasting a sensation warm to an implausible extent, she noticed. Sword, steel, when bathed in daunting heat then struck, metamorphosed into further strengthened steel. Though Wilhelm was a sword of a single swing, he was not a perfected sword. And now, having conceived heat, Wilhelm was now in the midst of metamorphosing after being struck as steel. And the role of striking the steel for that purpose was now solicited of Theresia. If the subject was a sword, then herself, the sword saint, must be au fait with it. Pertaining to this person, pertaining to this sword, she surely wished to understand.
Have you come to like flowers?
Spontaneously, she vocalized her usual question. Had there perhaps been a bystander observing the two, they may have ruminated on how nonsensical a consolation it was. However, only between the two, this was for the better.
I don't hate them.
And came a different answer to her unchanged question. And what the Theresia of back then thought of this was the following. Someday, when Wilhelm's answer would change, would Theresia be once again left to taste dejection, despondency, and the dread of being left behind? That did not occur. She simply loved his changing self. Metamorphosing, the steel seeking to become stronger, the sword of solitarily a single swing, was dear.
Why do you swing the sword?
Thus, surely, this question too had a different answer. And possibly, that answer would be the one that brought about salvation to Theresia.
Because this is all I could think of for a way to protect.
So responded Wilhelm, that he had naught but the sword. Yes, this person had naught but the sword.
It is all right, because that is how he is, this person.
That was all it was. Their routine conversation was no longer requisite between the two. However, that did not mean they forfeited opportunities to exchange words at the plaza. Rather, in terms of solely exchanging words, opportunities for that were more than before. Wilhelm, who visited the plaza for swinging the sword, came to kindly prioritize speaking to Theresia above swinging his sword. As he sat on steps surveying the panorama of the flower garden, she inclined her ears to Wilhelm's words, unfailingly destitute of topics. Limitlessly maladroit art of conversation, yet listening to his voice alone soothed her.
There was talk of conferral, and I became a knight.
The way he commenced the topic of the day, and his gaze vaguely conceived with heat. Though Theresia was poor at socializing and had continued to maintain distance from others, she was so stupid as to not realize the meaning behind those words of the youth, who mustered up such courage. A mere commoner, being deemed acceptable as a knight for his labor on the battlefield, was exceptional. Just how many feats the sword demon, Wilhelm Treiss had accomplished was something the worthless, cowardly, disenchanting sword saint was painfully aware of, as well as for what he, having been bestowed with the honor of knighthood, had attained this status for.
I see. Congratulations. You've gotten one step closer to your dream, isn't it?
Because she was aware of his true intent, Theresia responded deliberately with a casual attitude. Should she act casual, she could not help but blush for an instant. Devoting self-restraint into the entirety of her nerves, Theresia beamed a smile at Wilhelm, who had the expression of having tasted an under-shoulder swing down.
Dream?
You clutched the sword to protect, didn't you? A knight is someone who protects others, after all.
Upon Theresia's reply, Wilhelm nodded with a humbled countenance at once. Even though he was normally rebellious, he sometimes showed a childishly meek side of him. She wished her existence to be within what he wanted to protect. Despite partly possessing conviction, she hated her own self, who assured herself this way. Despite knowing their sentiments were surely transmitting to each other, her own self who abstained from undertaking action was truly, truly stupid, abhorrent, repulsive, irredeemable. Henceforth, yet again, Theresia erred. To the extent she deduced that, upon consideration, never had she done anything correctly. Ever. His hometown set ablaze, Wilhelm hurled himself into the battlefield all alone. Carol's report, out of breath, informing her of the unpredicted steadfast fight being put up by the sword demon, commenced pillaging Theresia of her body heat, nearly collapsing her to her knees at that very spot. Theresia, her countenance paling by the second, could comprehend Carol's swivet. She could comprehend it, but no vitality was incited within her. She knew the situation was that hopeless. Someone's inapposite voice entered Theresia's ears, who had her eyes focused onto the ground. It was not Carol, nor was it someone in the house. But she was acquainted with the voice, as though it belonged to someone who had been close to Theresia for long, and hence she noticed that it was the voice of the sword god's laughter, ridiculing herself who had always dissipated affection and love.
I have to go.
Whilst hearkening the sword god's laughter, Theresia slowly stood up. Even now, the derision yet persisted to echo within Theresia's small skull. However, whilst being mocked by the sword god, she must not relinquish everything this way. She had entrusted her elder brother with everything and led him to die, bedeviling her second elder brother, younger brother, and her uncle by pressing her own responsibilities onto them. She had led them to die.
But only him, only Wilhelm shall I not concede. Because that sword, that steel, only that person belongs to solely me!
Carol, prepare. Theresia-sama? However, your body's condition.
Prepare!
Carol, anxious about Theresia's physique, straightened her back upon the second order. Moving quickly, she immediately made all preparations required for Theresia. The battle suit, which had not been worn ever since the time of her first unit and first battle, and the long sword stranger to blood.
This time for sure. I won't make any mistakes.
Pledging an oath to the longsword she clenched, Theresia hastened Carol and jumped into the dragon carriage. The dragon carriages heading for Wilhelm's aid were of a greater number than Theresia's conjecture. These were many who were in the same unit as him, or those reciting debts of favor and gratitude towards him for having been saved by him. Though he was an unsheathed sword, that nothing but stinging youth was nowhere to be seen. By now, that youth had become a treasured sword, alluring many with his brilliance and sharpness. The front lines of Wilhelm's hometown had entirely crumbled by this point. Screeches and bellows reverberating, the battlefield pervaded by the scent of blood and burn. Amidst the far too ghastly, harrowing circumstances, Theresia's chest nauseated. She had envisioned herself standing on the battlefield countless times. However, the reality painted out the grisliness of her imagination with ease. In the battlefield, where wounds were inflicted, lives were taken, as blood and death ran rampant, something like resolve stood worthless.
At any rate, search for Wilhelm.
The one to raise his voice was Bordeaux Zellgef, leading an army of veterans. Upon his roar-esque command, the unit, wearing armor akin to rock, commenced moving in unity.
Theresia-sama, what should we...
Carol's voice resounded, asking for instructions, yet Theresia did not hear it. Bordeaux's group clashed with the enemy's soldiers, who had laid waste to his hometown. Amidst the fearsome scrimmage, she faintly sensed him.
Theresia-sama!
The instant she noticed, her legs moved. Theresia's feet bolted the battlefield, melded with warriors, with not a smidgen of incertitude. She need not even look to know where to head. Trod the soil, traversed through the heaps of corpses, and headed for the point where hollers of rage and wails of death converged. And upon reaching the locus saturated by the pungent odor of blood, Theresia saw. Right in those moments, before the collapsed Wilhelm stood a green demi-human, with a humongous sword upraised to be swung down. His face drenched in blood, Wilhelm was glancing up toward that humongous sword. His lips moved. With a debilitated, weak voice, he muttered something.
I don't want to die.
It's all right. It's all right, I assure you.
No longer could she hear anything. Theresia solely ruminated over what she had last heard, Wilhelm's whisper. She swung the longsword gripped in her hand. It was light. Making no sound, rather, making not even any impact, the demi-human was easily beheaded. She kicked, the gargantuan body collapsing whilst holding the humongous sword, such that it didn't fall on Wilhelm. At the same time, shots of animosity and bloodlust advanced toward Theresia's slender frame. All of their trajectories, she could sense them. She could read them. On her skin, she could feel them. Dodging them, Theresia followed a mysterious ray she could see with her sword. Unknowing of when they appeared, mysterious white rays levitated across the air. What was further mysterious was that her instincts knew all she had to do was to trace those rays with her sword. Tracing, tracing, her sword glided over the white rays. Her sword glissaded like wind, slashing the bodies of the demi-humans atop the rays from next to the next, severing their limbs, decapitating their heads, stabbing their abdomens, reaping their lives. The divine protection of the Sword Saint, the divine protection of the Death God, detonated upon the opportunity attained at long last. Upon losing the wrist, that wound shan't close. Upon impaling the abdomen, the bleeding shan't cease. Even the shallowest of wounds, their pain shall eat away and corrode for eternity. A glance, from the corner of her eyes, she glimpsed Wilhelm being held up. A youth bearing a shield, and beside him stood Carol. They were seeking to shoulder the dazed Wilhelm and withdraw from this theater.
Yes, that's good. Hurry, and please take Wilhelm away from a place like this.
Theresia-sama!
Carol clenched the pendant worn down her neck, beholding Theresia while she swung the sword. Her gesture, akin to prayer, verged Theresia to a little smile.
I guess so. It was just what Carol had said, isn't it? I am indeed stronger than anyone else, and better at killing than anyone else. If only I had noticed this a bit sooner.
The youth hurriedly took Wilhelm away, who was writhing in an attempt to remain here. Wilhelm, scraping the soil in resistance, failed to succeed due to the injuries veneering his entire body. His presence faded, by which she was relieved. Whilst feeling relieved, she plundered the lives of 1, 2, 3, easily, effortlessly, gashing, rending, slashing, washing away the hollers of rage and wails of death, washing away the everlastingly irksome, loud voice of the god of the sword.
Just let me hear solely his voice. He, who desperately clung to life. Kindly etch my reason for fighting like this. Please, make me believe that my sword can save Wilhelm.
The battle had come to an end. Theresia's purpose for plunging into the battlefield was achieved, and Wilhelm had returned alive. However, Wilhelm's goal could not be fulfilled, having fought to defend his hometown. His hometown burnt to ash, lost of even his parental home. He was now all by himself. Wilhelm, who had swung the sword retaining his rage, had a kill count of over 300. An unforeseen and atypical count for a single swordsman in a single battlefield. For that reason alone, Theresia's aptitude with sword, itemizing over 1,000 heads, deviated from normalcy. The existence of the Sword Saint was here. Her disgraceful first battle covered up, this instance became etched into history as Sword Saint Theresia's first battle. The battle itself may have amounted to unquestionable defeat, but she had managed to prove her overwhelming sword skill. The name of Theresia van Astrea became widely known across the kingdom, and potently boosted the morale of the warriors continuing to engage in combat on the battlefield. Of course, the sword demon youth must have hearkened it as well.
It's humiliating.
There had been no promise between them to meet again. Yet the two had conviction, should they head the square, they would meet each other. And as a matter of fact, it came true. Wilhelm, having arrived at the plaza, swung his sword down with aim set upon Theresia. Intercepting its trajectory with a hand, she halted it with 3 fingers. The optimum angle, the optimal degree of strength. Theresia was aware of it all. His sword strike arrested. What Wilhelm declared whilst crudely distorting his lips were words smeared in frenzied emotion unbecoming of this reunion.
Is that so?
Were you laughing at me?
Huh?
Answer me, Theresia! No, Sword Saint!
She had no such intentions. Neither was that excuse anything meaningful. It was true that, in a certain manner, Theresia had looked down upon Wilhelm's sword stance. She had seen through his flaws, never relayed them to him, and shut them within herself. That was all true. And it would be meaningless to discuss her intent. She swept the lunging Wilhelm's legs, violently toppling him. He inched closer with an expression grown frantic, but Theresia evaded it altogether and counterattacked. Before long, the struggle became one-sided, and in Theresia's hands was his treasured sword worn from use. The treasured sword which briefly unveiled the traces of his effort blotted by blood. A full swing, she had it glide upon the white ray, aimed set at Wilhelm's torso. The sword's pommel scythed his torso, and Wilhelm collapsed, his breathing clogged.
I won't be coming here anymore.
She could not bear him looking at her, with hatred, with mercy, with earnest cynicism. Theresia shook her head, and chose the option she had chosen countless times, to run away.
With a face like that, you shouldn't hold a sword.
Face to the ground, Wilhelm frantically wrung out in a rueful tone. The one to have espoused and believed in the beauty, the sublimity of the sword, was nobody but him. Her ability was to kick and trample upon his all.
I am the Sword Saint. I never understood the reason for that, but I finally understand now.
The congenital divine protection of the death god. The bestowed, albeit unwished-for, divine protection of the Sword Saint. It seemed she had achieved a compromise as to why she possessed them.
The reason?
To swing the sword to protect someone. I think that's nice.
To swing the sword to protect someone. She wished she had noticed something so simple much earlier. Although, even upon realizing that, she may not have been able to choose whom to protect. Now, she could.
Protect Wilhelm.
With this might, with this abominable, dreadful might of slaughter, protect Wilhelm as much as possible. Protect him. Protect her family. Protect Carol. Protect a greater crowd. And ultimately protect something even as humongous as the kingdom. She would become a fine sword saint.
Because I am the strongest. Because the Sword Saint is the mightiest. I may trample upon his feelings. I may betray what he believed in. But I solely cannot abandon the fact that I am the Sword Saint.
Just you wait, Theresia.
No longer present were any words to be exchanged. The voice reached Theresia's back, who stepped forth surmising this would be the last. She verged upon halting her legs. She desperately withstood that emotion. Whilst Theresia desperately withstood, Wilhelm's voice yet entered her ears.
I will take away the sword from you. I don't care about the divine protection and duties bestowed upon you. Swinging the sword, the blade's beauty. Don't you dare look down upon them, Sword Saint.
She was forewarned. It would be taken away from her. And once again echoed the voice of the sword god's laughter within her skull, as if to sneer at the youth, blazoning such abandon, as if to sneer at the beloved child, heart cradled by such spirit of fleeting hope. A period of 2 more years had been needed to end the Civil War. Ever since her parting with Wilhelm, Theresia cast herself onto all kinds of battlefields, and intently repeating perfervid and acute labor, she contributed to diminishing the demi-human alliance's war potential. The alliance too lost seniors who comprised its mainstay, its foundation weakening. It could be stated they had no choice but to comply with the proposal for peace the kingdom had offered. Henceforth, the greatest civil war of the kingdom, the demi-human war, diverged from its gruesomeness in its midst and ended identically, exceedingly swiftly, just as how it had broken out.
It's over?
She was resolved to tackle the next battle, the battle after the next, the battles with no end in sight. Thus, upon hearing the abruptly brought report of its denouement, Theresia lost her balance.
Yes, it is over. The Civil War has come to an end. It is Theresia-sama's achievement.
Catching the tottering Theresia in her arms, Carol pronounced innocently, Having grown to display such tender expressions more oft late, Carol firmly supported the bewildered Theresia and gently caressed her back.
Achievement, you say?
Those words did not really hit her. All Theresia did was to continue nothing but slashing, believing that it would consequently connect to protecting someone, believing it would save the youth who had arbitrarily left the troops by himself and gone to someplace. Theresia's such actions devoid of self-awareness, however, just as Carol had stated, shall be commended as the greatest service to the kingdom. A ceremony was held for her, wearing a formal dress with a sword of courtesy in her hands. Theresia failed to dispel the sensation that she was walking within a dream from the beginning to the very end. No, if this was a dream, then Theresia had always been walking within a dream. Ever since she had been blessed by the divine protection of the Sword Saint, ever since she had first felt the Sword God's presence near herself, Theresia's heart had been within the dream shown by that great being. Hence this too was a dream, the dream shown by the love of the Sword God, sunless evermore, never to be dispelled. Therefore, if there were to come a time she was liberated from this dream, then a commotion splintered the wild enthusiasm of the excited crowd in the ceremony. That being aimlessly stepped into the ceremony hall, in spite of all the voices calling for his restraint. In his hands, an unsheathed, decayed, tattered, rusty sword. He wore a dark brown, soiled tunic, the color of his visible skin also besmirched in dirt and filth. But before knitting brows to his state, there was something everyone could instinctively sense. Emanating from that being, the essence of dread. No, the essence of swordsmanship. Before the being wordlessly bracing himself, Theresia too faced him with the sword of courtesy. The king, standing on the same altar, halted the palace guards attempting to surround the outlaw. She was grateful for that. With this, no obstruction would come in the way. Nobody would now get in the way of her tryst with the sword demon here. No signals given. However, as though arranged forward beforehand, the blades of the two simultaneously eloped, giving rise to a shrill note. The rightfully dull blade directly collided with the unmistakably holy sword, albeit one for courtesy. Sparkles danced exuberantly, slashes tore the air, and two shadows intertwined on the stage as though in dance. Whilst swinging the sword, Theresia was struck with admiration, her mind enlivened, her heartbeats hastening. In Theresia's eyes, as ever, were the white rays concocted in the midst of battle. All she had to do was to trace those rays. All she had to do to kill was to trace those white rays. Such guidance of the sword gods could she see. The itinerary to triumph shown by the pinnacle of the sword, forged by the sword god, was being broken through by mere devotion and maddening ardor of the sword demon. The floating white rays were rent by the rusted sword as though they were visible. Intercepting every single one of the countlessly emerged white rays, the sword demon roared a war cry and stepped towards the pinnacle of the sword he couldn't ever reach. Heartbeats palpitated. Each and every time they exchanged blows. Each and every time their swords overlapped. Each and every time the contour of white rays was severed. Each and every time their gazes entwined. She was in love with the demon of the sword before her eyes. Each and every time, the Sword Saint fell in love with the Sword Demon. She loved him. She loved him. She loved him to an unbearable degree. She was in love with this person to an unbearable extent. The ceremony, utterly disordered, amidst the attentive gazes of a crowd so great, Theresia could not help but find it comical when she thought of what she was doing. Her cheeks hot, her chest palpitating, each passing moment, her love aggravated.
The truth is, I want to throw away my sword right away and jump into his chest. There is nothing to take away from me, ever since a long time ago, precisely when we first met. Ever since my heartbeat first rose because of you, I have...
The option for her to run away into comfort, refusing to face him, was thwarted. Not by the reprimanding voice of the sword god, but the glint in the eyes of the demon before her repudiated it with all his soul. That he shall take it away through his own strength, borrowing not the hands of anyone else, not even hers. With solely his own strength, with his own tenacity, with all he had proffered to the sword, he shall take the girl away from the sword god. Just how much? For how long? Just how many times? Hundreds of times? Tens of thousands of times? Hundreds of millions of times must he have thought of herself? The sword slashes melded, locked against one another. Their tips shimmered and exchanged blows however many times. And the swung strike accompanied by the sword god's enraged voice was... The rufous blade fractured. Its tip twirled into the air and bounced upon the altar. The one to achieve this, with not a smidgen of uncertainty, was the Sword Saint's soulful strike. All or nothing, the singular strike of the Sword Saint with nonpareil might. However...
My win.
The treasured sword had been taken from Theresia's hands. Her palm numbed by the impact, the treasured sword fell to her rear with a shrill report. And, positioned by Theresia's fair neck, was the halfway broken dull tip. The beautifully bedecked sword saint, lost to the uncouthly trained sword demon. That was the moment the treasured sword was defeated by the dull blade, and the fantasy known as the Sword Saint was shattered.
You're weaker than me, so you no longer have any reason to wield the sword.
The voice smote. Upon consideration, it had been quite a while since having heard his curt voice. And to think his first words would be this.
If I don't wield the sword, who will?
I'll succeed your reason for swinging the sword. You simply become my reason for swinging the sword.
His reason for swinging the sword was to protect something. You become that reason. While enunciating so, he took his tunic's hood off. As the sullied, sour face glared at herself, Theresia shook her head. To take it away from her, to protect her, in spite of having come to say such cool things. He truly did not understand the female heart. Although, he was a sword, so it could not be helped.
What a harsh person you are. To render all of someone's resolve and determination useless?
I'll succeed all of that too. You just forget that you ever held the sword and care freely. Let's see. You just live in peace behind my back, raising flowers or something.
That's so... whilst being protected by your sword.
That's right.
Will you protect me?
That's right.
If he were to count herself amidst what he cherished, and if he were to respond to her love, Theresia smiled at the words of the sword demon, of Wilhelm. Subsequently, touching the sword at her neck, she took a single step forward. By touching the sword blade, she felt Wilhelm's 2 years, pondering that all this time, if he had been thinking of herself, her chest warmed. With the rise of emotions she could not bear, tears appeased Theresia's eyelids. They slowly brimmed over and trickled down the smiling Theresia's cheeks.
Do you like flowers?
I don't hate them anymore.
Why do you swing the sword?
To protect you.
Her patience at its limit. Ever since she had relinquished the sword from her hands, she could no longer hear the sword god's voice. She saw nothing but Wilhelm. She felt nothing but Wilhelm. She had nothing but Wilhelm. Gently nestling close to his chest, she faintly tilted her head upward. Her eyes closed, Theresia's lips imbricated with the lips of Wilhelm. Love surged upon the soft, warm sensation, and Theresia's world revolutionized. With her cheeks dyed, she gazed at the man, her beloved, before her eyes. Wilhelm said nothing, silently awaiting her words. Such odd conduct. She was the one waiting. He seemed to not understand that. So once again, just like before, she initiated.
Are you in love with me?
You know that.
A brusque reply, and he averted his face. The moment she rounded her eyes upon the answer, in the world ensconced only by the two entered sounds, the temporal pause of the spectators came undone, and a large number of castle guards advanced towards them. Present there were the figures of personnel well acquainted with Wilhelm.
Goodness gracious.
As Wilhelm formed a somewhat relieved expression upon seeing them, she puffed her cheeks. To look someplace else when she is standing right before his eyes, just what impudence was this? She had not even heard him say the words he ought to yet.
There's something I want you to say, you know.
Wilhelm turned head, scratching his cheek as though to varnish the situation over. However, before long he yielded to Theresia's gaze and sighed, embracing her slender waist closer to himself once again, and gently drawing his face close to the astonished Theresia's ear.
Someday, when I feel like it.
It felt it would take a long time for him to feel like it. Bearing such displeasure in her mind, she nonetheless avidly anticipated that day's befall. Her weakness being what she lost her heart to, Theresia forgave the words of the one she loved.
After that, looking back on it now, a lot of things happened.
Welcoming Wilhelm as her husband, who had cut into the ceremony and had perpetrated unprecedented recklessness by asserting he would take away the leading lady, was one tribulation. Succeeding Theresia, who had quit being the sword saint, Wilhelm enrolling in the royal guard with the recommendation of Bordeaux and the others as well, was one tribulation. Having affirmed a lifetime of service to Theresia, Carol entered a relationship of love with one of Wilhelm's comrades, and the question of whether she would marry him or not was one tribulation. Having accumulated an exceeding number of large-scale feats in battle, Bordeaux being provided a seat in the committee that settled major political situations was one tribulation. With so much, truly so much happening, those days were really fun.
I'm in love with you, Wilhelm. What about you?
In the end, never did he ever pronounce the words that followed, though he did prove through his actions in his words' stead. Only either a kind woman, or a woman who was head over heels in love with the man could have been swindled by that, since both held true for Theresia, she kept on getting swindled. Their time as a couple passed in tranquility and carefreeness. Just as Wilhelm had promised Theresia, ever since that ceremony, never even once did he make her grip the sword. Neither did Theresia bear any lingering sentiments towards the sword. The sword god's voice had long become inaudible. Yet, the divine protection of the sword saint did occasionally come to surface. For example, when cooking, upon gripping a kitchen knife, she spontaneously understood the optimum angle for striking and such. Above all, having an ability to cut aptly comprised merely the first step in preparation. As she began to learn more about what followed, she started to realize that being a housewife was much tougher than being a swordsman. In addition, this was also about the time she learned how to control the divine protection of the death god. She accidentally cut her finger with the shell of an ingredient whilst cooking. Voluntarily created wounds were anyhow subject to the divine protection. Pallid from the wound she had carved onto herself, as she panicked in an attempt to somehow stop the bleeding. The bleeding ceased immediately.
Was it really so easy?
She thought, nigh revolted. Accepting the divine protection's existences and controlling their power. Despite of having been conferred a title so immense as the Sword Saint, in reality she was merely a little girl, without even a grasp on the things she possessed.
If only had this happened much earlier.
Such mighty emotions brimmed her heart, reminiscing the images of her brothers.
Theresia.
At such junctures, Wilhelm returned as though willfully, and as Theresia concealed her deepest heart, he removed her tender robes and domineeringly advanced. On such moments, she was saved.
Are you in love with me?
Only that question did he stubbornly refuse to answer, though.
After that again, a lot happened. Truly, a lot happened.
The couple's son was born, Heinkel. The lady whom Heinkel welcomed as his wife, and she gave birth to who would be Theresia's first grandchild, Reinhard. Nobody at all was to have been at any fault. Not Heinkel, whom she proudly called her son, who devoted greater sincerity and endeavor towards the sword than anyone, with full earnestness and effort. Nor the bride, who was afflicted by the illness called Sleeping Beauty, depriving Heinkel of any opportunity for vindication, and left the child Reinhard all alone. Nor Reinhard, blessed with talents capable of sending shivers upon a single glance, his childish frame crammed with preordainments of an unneeded extent. No one was at fault. That was why the one at fault, just as always, was herself. Heinkel distorted, the bride was taken prisoner to dreams, and Reinhard endeavored to be loved by such parents. She found herself, having been the first one to take notice of this and fail to do anything, to be the utmost foolish and good-for-nothing.
There is a battle called the Great Subjugation. A battle to bring down the White Whale. Over there,
A knight of the Royal Guard in name only, and a weighty mission in name only. The trembling voice of her son accreted upon this submitted proposition, and Theresia, alone and solitary, cemented a decision. The longsword she once favored and habitually used had since always been under Carol's care, retained in condition identical to back then.
I am against it. What are you thinking?
Though she was well aware this would happen, Wilhelm was against Theresia's decision. She was pierced by a sharp glint infused with will. His hair mingled with white, his voice lost of its former youthfulness. Even so, Wilhelm's foundation had not changed. His dignity, his zeal, his clumsiness, everything continued to be the way Theresia had fallen in love with, and continued to love.
I have already decided.
On your own? Just who asked for something like... Could it be?
Wilhelm realized on whose proposal Theresia's obstinate attitude came to be. His face tinted red with fury, his insuppressible essence of swordsmanship split open.
That idiotic buffoon. Feel some shame.
Neither you nor I have the right to say that.
Wilhelm identically lamented for their son, his furious expression fading. Wilhelm bit his lips. His fury persisted, yet suppressing his anger and feigning composure was something he had become adult-like in.
I too will take charge.
You have your own duties to fulfill. You must be aware of it, Wilhelm. It cannot be that you have forgotten it. Ford-sama's grief.
The daughter of the king's younger brother Ford had been kidnapped by someone who intruded into the royal castle. As the commander of the royal guard, Wilhelm had the duty of retrieving her at once. It was impossible to have the sword demon travel alongside to the great subjugation. The call made in substitution for him was for Theresia, the currently active successor of the divine protection of the Sword Saint, requesting her participation in battle. She could not refuse. Her days of tranquility lived in relinquish of the sword were solely concocted upon her own selfishness. She could not presume upon that any longer.
Theresia, something like this is...
Wilhelm.
Theresia called her husband, who attempted to persuade her all the more. Before his face, his breathing faintly halted. She inquired with a smile. A question, after a long time.
Are you in love with me?
What?
Unrest. The same emotion as the past, she saw. Whilst smiling, Theresia used her hand like a sword and swiped Wilhelm's shoulder. An attack that slashed the air, cleaved the skin. Bared defenseless before his wife, Wilhelm was unable to react to the strike coming from beyond the bounds of his attention, as the wound on his shoulder started to bleed.
Theresia, what are you doing?
The power of the divine protection of the death god was activated on the shallow wound on his shoulder. It wasn't severe, but the bleeding shall subsist. As long as Theresia remained next to him like this, as long as she didn't take distance from him.
Theresia?
Her body gently leaned onto his chest. Whilst feeling the sturdiness of the arms that caught her, Theresia placed her lips on the wound on Wilhelm's shoulder. The blood dyed her lips in vermilion. She felt the taste of her husband's blood for the first time.
With this, you can no longer come after me. Because if you're close to me, that wound will not close.
You did something so stupid for something like that? Let me make it clear. Even if the bleeding does not stop, still, I will...
If you do, then there'll be no point to this.
With a faint smile, Theresia let go of his body. And, whilst pointing towards the wound on Wilhelm's shoulder,
I'll leave that wound as is, so that you do not follow me. I'll close it once both our jobs are done. No need to worry. Who do you think I am? I am the strongest swordsman in this world. The most powerful after you.
Even if you compare yourself in your mid-40s to in your youth.
Don't say anything so redundant.
She flatly shut the mouth about to articulate discourtesy.
Jeez. This is how it was after more than 20 years of marriage.
The steel remained, yet unchanged. Hence...
I love you, Wilhelm. Yes, that's correct. Answer that afterwards.
Afterwards?
Wilhelm furrowed his eyebrows, to whom Theresia nodded. And, whilst pledging their reunion upon her husband's wound.
Upon my return, that day, please let me hear the words I didn't get to hear.
Her memories were evanescing, dissipating. Visibility disturbed within the sandstorm. Sounds of the environs became sporadic and difficult to grasp. Someone's wrathful roars, shrieks, screams could be heard. One plane of her visibility was saturated in verdant green. No, it was the ground. It was the hue of a grassland. Upon surveying the surroundings, a dense fog locked the world in its entirety less than 10 meters from her. The subjugation forces had suffered halfway decimation, and her unit faced annihilation. A desperate stampede began, and failed to perceive which direction to run into amidst the thick fog. However, solely a vague sense of titanic pressure from the other side of the fog could be felt. Hence, voices flew, fleeing to its opposite direction.
Huh?
All of a sudden, she was unable to remember what had occurred. Within the severe, violent clash, the engagement should have nevertheless progressed in their favor, and despite having long retired from battling, her might should have also served to be useful. That was how she ought to have felt. Her thoughts went only so far before she took notice of faint malaise. She glanced down to her palm. Something was off. There was no problem in her limbs, her eyes, her feet, but she somewhat felt as though she had lost her wings.
The divine protection,
she realized. No longer could she anywhere feel the sensation of the divine protection of the Sword Saint. All the same for the Sword God, who had remained beside her no matter how estranged and distant from the sword she was. That scorn was no longer anywhere either.
Reinhard!
Theresia simultaneously had a hunch to whom the divine protection had gone after vanishing from her body. Was this the same feeling her uncle got upon sensing that Theresia had inherited the divine protection? Otherwise, it may simply be that Theresia was aware of Reinhard's limitless natural talent. Whichever it may be, Theresia did not doubt that the Sword Saint of the next generation would be Reinhard. That intuition was perhaps traitorous to her own son, Heinkel, but no longer remained either anyone she could put the blame on, or the time for her to put blame.
Oh my. For a lone lady to remain in a place like this. Quite gallant indeed.
The graceful voice of a young girl, unbecoming for the time and place, resonated. Turned back, and Theresia saw a petite shadow within the dense fog. White clothes, platinum-tinted hair. Intimate and affectionate, an amiable gaze imbued with sympathy boundlessly extolling togetherness towards the unacquainted. Misdirected love to an odious extent.
It seems I have not quite been taking a liking to.
Bracing her longsword, Theresia stepped forward. Had she been in peaceful times, she may have borne concern for the young girl. However, this was the world of death, ruled by the dense fog of the white whale. A young girl emerging here transcended mystery. Even without the divine protection of the Sword Saint, Theresia's body bequeathed part of a former genius with the sword. Manifesting adequate ability of the zenith of swordsmanship, the bolting slash rent the young girl's petite figure in twain.
I wish to understand you.
The young girl's voice tickled her eardrum, and her consciousness was impeded with a splintering sound. Within the darkness, her consciousness descended. As though sinking within lukewarm water with her limbs bound, Theresia's body submerged, wilting. The future of her grandson, the heart of her son, the bride who connected the two. Worries and disquietude ran past her as though in haste. And, in the end,
Wilhelm!
Calling the name of the man she loved, her consciousness ceased in its entirety. And
a pathetic face.
Steadily opening her eyelids, there she saw a crumpled face. His head had become completely white, and more wrinkles of aging had proliferated on his face. But she could not help but think that this was handsome in its own right. There was no way she could have mistaken. It was the face of her husband, though it seemed quite some time had passed since that parting. She inhaled a deep breath. There were others close by. Could have been Heinkel and Reinhard. She could feel their presence. All three men of the Astrea family had assembled here, perhaps gone out of their way just to meet her, just to give her a send-off. Because everyone was so kind.
Theresia,
Wilhelm choked on his breath, his face etched with wrinkles. Exceedingly unseemly before their son and grandson. Just where had he forgotten his dignity and majesty? Above all, looking back at it now, such weakness of his surprisingly stood out always as well.
Listen, Wilhelm.
Her voice was husky, yet peculiarly youthful. As if it was not hers. No, it was unmistakably hers, but she was supposed to be a proper grandma now. It seemed like her voice back from when she had first fallen in love. How embarrassing. When she had first fallen in love, she felt awkward upon feeling so. There was not much time left, yet they wasted time simply gazing into one another. But even still, that was all right. Theresia had sufficiently conveyed the words she should have conveyed. Wilhelm, too, must realize that. Therefore, the one in need of time, of opportunity, of words, was him. Theresia should simply, quietly, wait for those words. Albeit she would have to wait, her hopes would assuredly be fulfilled. That was the kind of man Wilhelm Trias was. That was the kind of husband Wilhelm van Astrea was.
There's something I must tell you. I am a poor speaker. I failed to convey my thoughts well and caused hardship to you as well. That is why, even in more than 20 years, never even once did I. For 20 years, I've made you feel distressed, but I am
a stupid person.
Seeing him struggle to speak, as he clumsily fumbled to form words, she could no longer bear it, ended up laughing. Truly, just what was this man saying?
Did you really never notice?
Her hand reached for the cheek, earnestly seeking heartbreak, the countenance verging on tears even now. Her body was terribly heavy. There was not much strength left in her body, but pouring all of her remaining strength into her fingers, she wiped away the tears trickling down his face.
You had always been saying it.
Did he perhaps intend to hide it? Did he perhaps intend being able to conceal it by simply never expressing it in words?
Your eyes, your voice, your conduct, your actions, always.
All of what Wilhelm had directed towards Theresia had been, more than anything, clearly conveying this person's heart.
I am with you.
You are with me. That was why. It was sufficient. In love. From the beginning till the end, my life was surely one filled with blessings. I had my brothers, whom I was cordial with. I had a female friend who was always warm towards me and took tender care of me. I was saved by many people. I met Wilhelm. I'm sure lots of problems still must be remaining. But I have faith that you will all be all right. But the truth is, there is just one thing. There is just one last thing left in my heart that I regret I didn't get to ask. How surprised would you be if you got to know that it was actually love at first sight?
Their exchange of words of love with one another was the end. Smiling in satisfaction, her cheeks dyed with a hint of love, and eyes glistened with tears. Theresia van Astrea's form lost its shape and crumbled in the blink of an eye. Within the arms of the kneeling Wilhelm, no longer visible was the figure of a bloodied, gasping woman. What was bequeathed was only a wreath of ashes, and that alone gave credence to the sentiment that she was here. Her life incinerated within his arms, Theresia had become a wreath of ashes. Wilhelm looked down towards such vestiges of Theresia's. His gaze simply casted down, wordless.
Are you satisfied now?
And, instead of the silent, immobile Wilhelm, a man raised his voice. The red-haired, middle-aged man, Heinkel, aimed a glare pervaded with hatred at Reinhard, who was standing beside him. Reinhard slowly met that gaze and shed a sigh.
Satisfied? What do you mean?
Don't play dumb, it's just how we saw it. Are you satisfied? You must be satisfied now. Both in name and in reality, the position of Sword Saint's all yours now. Congratulations. The rumors of you robbing it by killing the previous generation are now true without a speck of a doubt too. Tell me, aren't you satisfied, hey?
I do not quite understand what you are saying.
Don't make that blank face, you shitty brat.
Exhaling a hoarse breath, Heinkel tried to grab Reinhard. However, Reinhard avoided his fingers and constrained the body of his real father through his palm, as the latter stomped the ground to a paining extent. There remained not a scintilla of impact on the form of the current generation Sword Saint for slashing the previous Sword Saint to death. The truth is, it didn't serve to be an opponent either. As though that truth was shoved onto him, Heinkel's throat faintly shuddered.
Don't get carried away, Reinhard. Ugh.
Attempting to inveigle such tremors of his own heart, Heinkel grew further frantic and spat out whilst pointing a finger towards Reinhard.
No matter how many sweet nothings you line up, what I saw won't change. It is fact that you slashed down Mother, Theresia van Astrea. I'll proclaim it. I'll spread the word, such that nobody approves of you as the Sword Saint anymore. No matter how unconcerned you look, there is no way you'll let go of your honor as Sword Saint. You may have dubiously managed so far, but not anymore. The one slashing down his own blood relative to death is the Sword Saint? The Sword of the Kingdom? Don't make me laugh, you murderer!
Deputy Commander, no matter how many times you say it, I do not understand what you mean. It is the Deputy Commander's misunderstanding that I cut down the previous generation's Sword Saint.
Huh?
To Heinkel, who argued vehemently, Reinhard gave a quiet response. Heinkel rounded his eyes upon those words, but Reinhard did not seem to intend deception or making excuses. Reinhard did not seek to opine. Reinhard was stating the truth.
The enemy just now was merely a corpse mobilized via some secret arts. It could not have been the previous generation Sword Saint grandmother. Did you not misconceive something?
Heinkel made a stupefied expression at Reinhard's words. He then rammed his hands into his red hair, tearing them off violently, a faint laughter leaking him, Heinkel with an unhinged smile.
Then what was that at the end? When she was talking to Father? When she was glaring so bitterly at you and me? What was that if not Mother?
Enough now. Stop, Heinkel.
Canines bared, Heinkel burned with emotion transcending hatred. The one to halt Heinkel's fury was Wilhelm, having maintained silence until now. The aged swordsman, remaining in his crouched stance, tore a sleeve of his coat and treated the wound on his right leg, the locust impaled by the long sword. The wound that should not close due to the ability of the divine protection of the death god had started losing its efficacy since the moment Theresia's being was lost. No, prior to that, it had stopped from the juncture the sane Theresia had returned. What ached instead was the wound carved onto his left shoulder at their parting. The sane Theresia on his left shoulder, and the demised Theresia on his right leg. With the loss of both, the wounds carved with the divine protection of the death god dispelled in their efficacy.
Stop, you say, Father? Are you fine with that? This guy's...
Stop, Heinkel. Stop.
As Heinkel attempted to snarl again, Wilhelm forbade him once more. Taking off his coat, now lost of a sleeve, Wilhelm wrapped Theresia's ashen vestiges in the opened cloth. It would be far too lonesome to abandon her to the wind's mercy as is. He believed he must, at the very least, return her ashes back to her grave. Seeing the state of his father, Heinkel gnashed his teeth in vexation and swallowed his words. And, retrieving the ashes, Wilhelm stood up on a teetering gait. Even if his bleeding had ceased, his body had lost a considerable amount of blood. The wound on the joint of his right leg was deep, making it feel uneasy to let him walk by himself. Reinhard instantly attempted to support his tottering shoulders. However...
Stay away.
Wilhelm's bellow abjured those fingertips about to touch him. Reinhard halted his raised arm, and Wilhelm did not attempt to turn towards his countenance. Gazes never intertwined, the sword demon inhaled silently.
Reinhard.
Yes?
Contrasting Wilhelm's quivering voice, Reinhard's voice was confident and dignified. Closing his eyes upon hearing his tone, Wilhelm articulated. It was a question.
Do you regret that you slashed your grandmother, Theresia, to her death?
A faint interval sojourned in the answer to the question. Or perhaps this dialogue may have gotten deemed meaningless, similar to Heinkel's earlier. However, following a pause, Reinhard responded.
No. I did the correct thing. I shan't regret it.
I suppose so. That's right. You are correct. I am mistaken. That is why there is no longer anything to talk to you about.
Responding with a quiet voice, Wilhelm turned his back to Reinhard. The grandfather and grandson, without ever facing one another, concluded the decisive dialogue. And, with a single upraised finger, Wilhelm pointed towards the city's center.
I am worried about City Hall, to which Garfield Dono is headed. If it would be possible, then I request you head there to provide support. Sword Saint Reinhard Dono.
Terribly formal and unduly distant. Upon his polite words, Reinhard looked in the direction his finger was denoting. He then nodded, and finally glanced toward Heinkel. Heinkel, yet charred with hatred, faintly paused his breath to those blue eyes, but Reinhard let pass such trivial terror of his.
Outdoors is dangerous. Deputy Commander, if it would be possible, then head to a shelter, along with Wilhelm Dono.
You just shut the hell up! Hurry up and disappear!
Hurled with the words of a seeming sour loser, Reinhard turned his face away. He then bolted towards the waterway, leaping as though to kick the water's surface. With momentum enough to bound over a building, he disappeared in the direction of the city's center. Witnessing his inhumane talent and ability, Heinkel spat. He subsequently rushed to Wilhelm, who was steadily dragging his right leg as he walked. However,
Honored father going alone is...
Please, leave me alone. I do not want anyone to see my face right now.
Father.
There is no need for you to worry about me. You should just worry about your own safety. Hide yourself in a suitable building or shelter. You should be fine.
leaving solely his opinion behind, Wilhelm walked, deserting Heinkel. His wife's ashes wrapped in the coat he carried, he dragged his feet and faded into the distance. Left behind, unable to call for his halt or walk by his side. Left behind, as Wilhelm dwindled out of view, Heinkel was...
What's your problem? What's your problem? What's your problem? What's your problem? Damn it, what the hell is your problem?
In the plaza, bereft of anyone, glaring at the stone pavement, Heinkel spouted out his fury, tearing at his head, roaring his rage inexplicable in words. He hurled the sword fixed by his waist to the ground. Strummed by the ground with a solid echo, the beautiful night sword glided across the floor and fell.
Shit. Fucking everyone, just go die! Just go die!
In the deserted plaza, bereft of anyone, only Heinkel's bleeding screech resounded in solitude. The screech, melding boundless, ceaseless resentment and grief, echoed far and wide. Grandfather, father, grandchild, the battlefield uniting the Astrea family, thus drew its conclusion. A lady, a grandmother, a mother, a wife. The end of Theresia van Astrea engraved wounds upon the hearts of the respective three. With this, all battlefields in the fight of the Watergate city of Prestela drew their curtains.